Hi, and welcome to Les Bons Mots, a podcast about language learning by ACA, a language training school based in Quebec, Canada. This podcast is for people who are learning languages, and every episode will cover a different topic connected to language learning. Every other week, we'll be bringing you a mini-sode with different tips and tricks to help you on your language learning journey. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Britta Potion Reader, and this week I'm joined by my guest host and colleague, Christopher Ashton. Christopher is an ESL teacher at ACA and also a psychology teacher at an English-speaking college in Quebec City, where he gives lectures on the development of language and first language acquisition. We're going to be talking about stress and anxiety in language learning, a topic that's important because it affects a lot of people who are learning a language. Let's get started. Christopher, thank you for joining me on Les Bons Mots today. Do you prefer Christopher or Chris?
Chris is fine. Chris is fine. I was always called Christopher by my mother when I was in trouble, so I got into a habit of being called Chris.
Okay, let's go with Chris because you're not in any trouble today, I promise. I'm especially excited to have you here to talk about language learning and some of the emotions that can surround it because you have a background in psychology.
I have my master's degree in clinical psychology.
That's fascinating. I've mentioned before on the podcast that I'm learning French and Spanish. Are you learning a language, Chris?
I'm actually currently learning French. I've been living in Quebec City for about 5 years, and when I arrived, I didn't speak any word in French. So it's definitely been an experience. But when I was living in the United States, I took 5 years of Spanish language in the classroom, and I remember none of it because I never utilized it out in public. So this has been a whole new ballgame for me, actually living immersed in the city and having an opportunity to practice my French each and every day has definitely been a blessing.
I've had the same experience with learning French since I came to Quebec compared to learning it in a classroom in high school in British Columbia. It was a lot of grammar and exercises and dictation activities, but not a lot of chances to practice. So it's been a real eye-opener to actually speak to people and learn how to use a language now that I'm in the Quebec context as well.
Yeah, grammar in the classroom, it's wonderful, but it doesn't always translate to real world situations. So when you get out into the public, sometimes you tense up because you're not sure what to expect out of those conversations and how fluently you can respond. And I think we get stressed out about that.
And that's one of the things that we're here to talk about. And that leads us really nicely into the first question that we can consider when we talk about stress in language learning and emotions in language learning. And that is, what are some of the emotions that people experience when they're learning a language?
So as I just mentioned, stress and anxiety are highly prevalent. When we use our second language in an unfamiliar context, we feel like there's a lot at stake, almost like we have something to prove that we are adept at handling that conversation. And I think all of that emotion builds up inside of us, and we feel worried that we're not going to be able to perform at the level we either need to or that we expect ourselves to. Some individuals also feel frustration when they can't articulate exactly what they want.
But it's not all bad, is it? I mean, I think that there's a few positive emotions that we have when we're learning a language. Sometimes I know I feel really proud of myself when I'm able to successfully manage an interaction in French that I was a bit nervous about. What are some of the other positive emotions that we might feel?
Well, just generally feeling happy, being in a context where maybe you're not so sure of yourself and then having that interaction go very well. We feel this sense of satisfaction. I did something well in this circumstance. I was able to have a meaningful conversation. And I think that really boosts your morale.
Absolutely. I think that it also gives us a little bit of confidence for the next time we have to try a new or unfamiliar conversation or context in using our language there.
Yeah, general feeling like we're going to succeed later on. I agree.
hmm When we think about language learning, there's something that's sort of unique about it. Maybe another subject that would be a little bit like language learning is mathematics, but I know people don't generally get really emotional about the process of learning geography, for example. So, what is it about language learning that is unique and makes it a little bit more of an emotional process?
I think language encompasses everything about our world. We use language as a filter for guiding us through all these subjects. We learn geography through language. We learn mathematics through language. So our previous, past experiences definitely color our current attitude about, what our experiences are going to be later on. If we had a bad experience about language, we might perceive language learning to be bad later on. And if we had a good experience learning language or utilizing that language, I think we feel a lot more confident as we go on through, right? Because we're using our lives as a filter for our utilization of this language.
I think that that's an excellent point, and it ties together to a theory called the effective filter hypothesis that a researcher called Krashen proposed. And that's the idea that a student's anxiety or low self esteem or lack of motivation can actually block language learning to some degree. And then it becomes kind of like a self fulfilling cycle because you feel badly, then it's difficult to learn the language. That doesn't exactly cause good emotions, so it becomes almost like a self-perpetuating cycle, and we really don't want any of our students to be experiencing this, eh?
Exactly. All of this stress that we're feeling about performing, all of our energy is going to that stress and not on the actual performance of the language. And then we don't perform well, which begets more self-esteem issues. And then this has problems with our language, and then more self-esteem issues. So it does become this self-fulfilling prophecy. I agree.
Another reason that language can be such an emotional process is because it's connected to identity. You mentioned that it's a way that we filter the world around us, and it's also an important way that we connect with the world around us and we convey who we are. We use it to make human connections. But as learners of a second language, sometimes we're not fully able to convey the depth of our experience and our intelligence.
I think that sometimes we understand who we are in our first language and our mother tongue, and we expect that when we go into second language circumstances, we're going to be that same person. We're going to have that same personality. And when we realize that we don't, I think the first thing that pops up into our head is we feel incompetent. I know that I felt this when I first started learning French. I felt that, I had a manner of intelligence, I had a matter of humor that I felt was lost in that second language. And it's taken some time to really understand who I am in the context of French rather than English, right? It's not that I'm being inauthentic or I'm being different. It's just an alternate side of myself that I have to convey.
I think that that's a really important point to keep in mind is that when we're learning a second language, we're also negotiating our own identity in that language. And another important factor in language learning that also may be tied to emotion or particular feelings is the reason that we're learning a language at all. So the motivation for learning it, if a person is learning a language because they've arrived in a new country as a refugee, perhaps after some traumatic experiences or very difficult circumstances, the reason for learning the language may be very different, and the feelings about learning the language may be very different from someone who is learning a language because they moved to a new country to be with their partner, or perhaps to move for economic reasons in search of a particular job. These different reasons for language learning may also sort of affect how we feel about it.
I think they also affect how rapidly we're going to achieve this. If we feel like we have to integrate into the society for our success, we're going to be a lot more motivated to sit down and learn and practice. When we're doing it our own leisure, especially when we have busy lives, I think it's easy to say, oh, I'll put this off until later. I'll practice my language tomorrow. But when you're really immersed in that language, it's kind of, a survival mechanism in a lot of ways. So I think we're going to put a lot of effort into it.
So, really, we're coming around to talking about motivation here and the motivation for language learning. When we talk about motivation, often we talk a little bit about internal motivation and external motivation. Chris, would you break down a little bit for us what these kinds of motivation are and how they can affect us?
Sure. I'll start with external motivation. So, external motivation is that we are motivated from the outside. It's external forces that are providing the circumstances that require us to perform. So, for example, if our parents force us to learn the language as a child, then we're doing it to appease them. Or maybe we're putting an effort to get a good job so that we'll have money to put food on the table. Or maybe the external motivation is being able to fit in as a member of society. Whereas the internal motivation is the desire to learn for the sake of learning. So it might be not just to get a job for economic purposes, but to get a job that I really love and I feel like is worthwhile doing. Or maybe it's for love. Maybe it's meeting someone new and feeling like you would want to communicate with that individual. Sometimes, in terms of internal motivation, embarrassment, I know this is a very difficult emotion, but it's one of those emotions that we're most afraid of and is sometimes the strongest motivation for wanting to improve. We don't want to put ourselves in a circumstance that makes us look incompetent or makes us feel unworthy. So that minute we feel that embarrassment, we're like, okay, no, it's go time. We need to push forward and move past this. And I don't know about you, Britta, but I've had embarrassing experiences with my French language in the city. And that was really something that made me want to learn a little bit more so that I wouldn't put myself in those circumstances again.
I promise, Chris, you're not alone in embarrassing yourself in using other language incorrectly and making mistakes around the city. I'm pretty sure that everywhere I go in Montreal, I leave a trail of misunderstandings. Sometimes it feels like, but as you mentioned, it's something that we can use in a way not to get stuck in that feeling of embarrassment and beat ourselves up about it, but to use sort of as fuel for the fire of motivation, to use it as an opportunity to say, okay, this is not serving me. These negative emotions are not necessarily serving me. I'm just going to put it into effort and put it into improvement.
Exactly. And to find those learning strategies that'll help us face those negative emotions head on.
You and I are both language teachers, so I know this is something that we have a lot of practice with as learners and on the teacher side as well. So we talked about the reasons for learning a language and motivation. But the other important piece is context. So when we talk about the context of language learning, we're thinking about where we're learning it, from whom we're learning it, and as we mentioned, what reason. And you were mentioning to me, Chris, when we were preparing for our episode, some sort of interesting information about how context and our brain's physiology interact. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So when we are children and we're learning our first language, our brains, we have a left hemisphere of our brain, the left side, and a right hemisphere of our brain. And our left hemisphere has a lot of functions, but handles a lot of analytical, logical, rational thought. Our right side is more about social connection and using our emotions to filter the world. But as young children, our brains are not very specialized or what we call lateralized. So we're creating a lot of connections for language in both hemispheres. As we get older, our brains start to specialize a little bit more. So our left side of our brain is doing most of the language storing and processing. So the older we get, the less emotional our language capabilities tend to be. So if we're learning language as an older adult, this is what we call a subordinate bilingual. We're filtering this new second language through our first language. And it's not as hot, meaning it's not as emotional. Sometimes when we're in an argument in our first language, we're acting out of instinct. It's an immediate emotional reaction. Well, we don't often have this opportunity with our second language. So when we get stuck in a particular context that needs to be emotional, that needs to be social, we tend to try to think rationally. And this sometimes puts us in a tough spot where we're not acting as spontaneously as we could be. And this is why a lot of second language learners as adults get stuck.
That's so fascinating. And this is true as well for what we call compound bilinguals, which are children who grow up learning two languages. Unlike someone who's learning the language as an adult, children are going to have equal connection between the emotional part of their brain and the language acquisition part of the brain, regardless of which of their two languages that they're operating in. It's so interesting to learn about how our brains work in language acquisition and how the sort of internal context changes with language acquisition. But we should also take a look at some external conflicts as well, and what we know about the effect of external social or cultural contexts on language learning. So I know that in recent years, there's been quite a lot of study in this field, and that theories of language learning that have historically focused on processes of language learning, meaning what kind of input do learners receive, how do they process it, and what kind of output do they produce, those theories began to change. Our conception of second language acquisition began to change sort of around the 1990s or so, didn't it?
Yeah, some linguists felt that there was a psycholinguistic bias in language learning, and they felt that the emphasis was on language going in, being processed and understood, and then being produced by the speaker or the learner, and a more sociocultural view of language learning was needed. This is because language learning doesn't only happen in internal mental processes or in a vacuum, it happens in a broader social context, and that context influences how we learn a language. It doesn't happen in a book or in a list of exercises. It happens in the interactions we have in that language, using that language.
We alluded a little bit earlier to our classroom experiences, you with Spanish and me with high school French. And we can think about these kind of learning contexts. And this is not to be negative about this type of context, but it's to recognize that sometimes we as learners attempt to use explicit knowledge that we learned in class. So we think about grammar rules that we learned, or we think about set phrases or exercises that we learned. And when we try to use those at times in actual communicative interactions in the real world, it can be quite challenging because it doesn't always translate. Why do you think that is?
I think sometimes when we're using our language, this is being facilitated through interpersonal relationships. And there's a lot of risk taking behavior that comes with trying to utilize the grammar that you learned in the context of a learning style classroom and push it on interpersonal relationships, which, take time. They're difficult to establish. And I think that's what gets us caught up is that we don't quite understand how to utilize the grammar that we've learned in an authentic way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we feel like we can't be ourselves completely, or we don't know how to respond emotionally in these interpersonal relationships and contexts.
We mentioned Krashen earlier when we were talking about sort of the feedback loop that we can get into where we have a bad experience in language learning and motivation. He also had a really interesting hypothesis called the acquisition learning hypothesis. And if we accept his hypothesis, then we need to spend more time using authentic language in our language classes, both as learners and as teachers when we're planning them, in order to give our students the chance to develop that competency, and that this can be more effective than teaching decontextualized grammar rules or decontextualized language chunks.
I think some students, especially that I've seen in my classroom, are able to utilize grammar in a spontaneous discourse within the context of the classroom. And sometimes they get stuck when they go out into public because you cannot, as I mentioned before, predict what conversations are going to happen. So if we use more authentic language with our students, they're going to feel better prepared to handle authentic conversations.
So, as learners, really what we need to be thinking about if we find ourselves shopping for a language class or considering taking a language class is we need to think about the approach that the class is going to take and how they're going to give us an opportunity to practice communicative skills. We really want to look for situations that are going to allow us to do realistic communication. Of course, a classroom isn't a perfectly realistic environment, but as closely as we can, we want classes that are going to mimic the kinds of contexts in which we're going to need to use our second language. In a traditional classroom, like the repeat after me model, or the kind of classroom that we experienced when we were younger in school at times, when you found yourself with Spanish and I found myself with French, actually having to produce it, our confidence and our ability and our competency really wasn't there. So again, looking for that meaningful opportunity to have realistic and meaningful conversations and contexts can definitely help us reduce that social stress. At least that's been my experience.
Exactly. I think that the repetitive nature of traditional learning context makes language feel a bit robotic. But one of the issues is when we use a second language, it's not just grammar obstacles, it's also the emotional ones that we have. And I don't think we're always taught in a traditional classroom the emotional cues, the emotional context. A class which provides you with opportunities to build your confidence in meaningful conversations and context will then reduce any social stress that you may have in using your second language.
And this really affects our motivation, which in turn affects our investment, the effort that we're putting into language learning. So we've got the motivation on the inside, and then the investment, how that translates into action, right? The actual action and work of learning a language. If we have a learning environment that isn't welcoming, it's going to affect our engagement, our investment, and it's just not conducive to good learning. And I think, fortunately, as a discipline, we're moving more towards a communicative approach to language teaching as well. So, Chris, we've started talking a little bit about language classes. For all of our audience members who are language learners, maybe we can get into some of the takeaways of all of this theory that we've been discussing. So, for my part, one thing that I try to do is embrace second language Britta, the Britta who isn't an Anglophone. Spanish speaking Britta, she's really funny. She loves to laugh. She speaks in a way that's even more animated than I'm doing right now, if you can imagine it. French speaking Britta's a little bit different too. You know, she's a Britta who she's not as crazy as Spanish speaking Britta. You know, she's a little bit more deferential, but she still loves to chit chat with her neighbors, and still really enjoys that. So you mentioned before sort of developing the identity. I really think that this is a key point.
It's funny that you say deferential because I think that's how I would describe myself in French, but I also like that chit chat. I like to have those small conversations with people. I know I'm not going to be the same person in French that I am in English, and I just have to embrace that that's okay, and that's more than enough.
Yeah, absolutely. So embracing our other language self, that's one important way that we can sort of just appreciate this process of learning a language. But there are some other takeaways as well. Chris, what would you like learners to keep in mind as they're learning?
I think we have to recognize what we risk and what we gain. And if we understand that what we gain is much more valuable, I think, coming to that realization is going to help us a lot. If the materials that we have are engaging to us, if the context is engaging to us, then we're going to be more energized and taking interest in this language learning process. If we find a class that provides us a chance to practice actually using the language in a safe environment with supports. I know in my classroom, one of the rules that I have is a student is not allowed to say sorry for making a mistake. That if you
Hmm.
make a mistake, we're going to correct it and we're going to move on. And I think this kind of reduces some of that stress. And if you can find a class where you feel engaged and excited that this is your downtime to learn, I think this is going to help you reach that next level. We need to use our second language in meaningful ways. Would you agree with that?
100%. I would encourage anyone who's learning a language and who's considering a class rather than self-study to think about what your challenges are and find a class that addresses those. If you find it difficult talking to people on the telephone, consider a telephone class. It's going to give you exactly the practice that you need in order to do that. If your challenge is small talk, maybe you want to think about going to a meetup, or maybe you want to think about going to some type of event that's connected to a personal interest you have. If you're an artist interested in visual arts, take an art class in the language that you're learning. Really trying to make practice opportunities that are meaningful for us as learners. It's so connected, as you mentioned, to motivation. And so maybe we can take a little dive into what this means for us as teachers, what understanding this broader sociocultural context of language learning means for us as teachers. So you mentioned providing an environment that's conducive to learning, finding a class that's like that. So as teachers, the onus is on us to create an environment that is non-threatening, that does as much as we can to reduce stress in our students and make them comfortable taking risks, using new structures, using new vocabulary, because mistakes are an inevitable part of taking risk. And as you said, we don't want anyone to feel ashamed or stressed about making mistakes because it's just part of the process.
Exactly. And realistic and meaningful communication is the goal that we have. So if we can, the learning context, the grammar, the vocabulary, it's definitely important. But if we can mimic as a communicative context as much as possible, I think the students are going to let their guard down. They're going to open up and they're going to feel more comfortable taking those risks.
Hmm. We talked a little bit about how when we learn a first language, that we have more of a connection between emotion and instinct. And one of the things that we need to engage in a way, for our second language learners who are older, who are adults, is something that we can call emotion lending. Would you feel comfortable explaining that?
Sure. So emotion lending for me, it's exactly what it sounds like. We lend our emotional capacities and project that onto our students. So when learners feel the burdens of negative emotions, it's the teacher's job to transform them into positive, empowering emotions. Sometimes we have this experience of fight or flight. When there's a stressful situation, we can fight this, head on, or we can run. And for a lot of language learners who feel anxious, who feel nervous, who feel frustrated, their objective is to run, to move away from those conversations. Let's actually reformulate our ideas of what these, emotions are, and let's fight. Let's actually push forward in these conversations. Let's take these risks. Let's not be worried about making mistakes. We encourage mistakes. Mistakes are exactly how you learn. So when a student makes mistakes, we don't criticize them for the mistakes. We correct them and we move on. And I always talk about the mistakes that I make in my own language learning, so that they feel comfortable knowing that if my teacher's doing this too, then I'm going to be just fine. I'm going to be okay.
What if knowing all of this, having all of this theory, having this understanding of like what kind of classes we should be looking for and what kind of factors within ourselves affect our learning, affect our motivation, what if we are still left feeling a little bit stressed about this whole situation? Maybe we can go through a couple of quick final tips as well, and things to bear in mind that our audience can take with them. What do you think?
I think the first thing that I would want is to choose a trusted person in my life to either practice with or to take classes with. When we're nervous and we feel alone, we tend to put up a wall. But when we're with someone we care about, that wall comes down. And this person could be a friend, a family member, a colleague, or another classmate. And if you feel comfortable, at least knowing one person in the class, you're going to be comfortable in that class, or at least more comfortable than otherwise.
Hmm.
Also, we can choose a class that suits us. So if we're feeling really shy, maybe you can take a private class so that you can build your confidence first. And if you're more comfortable speaking with a group of people, then take group classes where you're with other individuals who are at a similar level to you in the language learning process, and you can take risks together.
I think that those are excellent points. And I think that there's a couple of things we can also bear in mind, strategies that we can use when we're actually using the second language as well. One is to try to remove as many barriers as you can before you have an interaction. This is a strategy that I use myself all the time. Before I know that I'm going to have to use French in a new context, I'll think about the vocabulary that I need to use. I'll think about how I'm going to structure what I'm going to say. I'll try to predict a little bit what the other person might say or what the other person might ask me. And sometimes, honestly, I'll do some mental rehearsal of my sentences. If it's really like something I'm really feeling stressed about, I might even like check a couple in a translation tool, just to make sure I know what to say and how to say it, check pronunciation of anything. If we can do a little bit of preparation, that's going to kind of remove some of that stress, or using our second language in different contexts that might feel a little bit more achievable. So maybe it's making a comment on a post on social media. Maybe that doesn't feel too stressful. We can do that and we can be like, okay, I did that. That was okay. It's a small victory that we can use to take us on to the next situation. Maybe I ask my colleague who speaks French to have a coffee with me. We take a little coffee break in French together. We commit to 15 minutes of speaking French with each other, and that's a pretty low stress kind of situation to practice in.
I've even had students who've told me that their kids are learning a language too. So dinner time, on Friday night is their English night or their Spanish night. And that way
Mhm.
they're practicing in a supportive environment with people they love. And it, again, breaks down these barriers and the stress that comes with language learning.
Absolutely. I think the main thing also is to be compassionate to ourselves as language learners. A lot of my students, and I know for myself, are very harsh self critics. We make mistakes and we think, oh, I can't believe I said that. Oh. But if another person were to make the exact same mistake in our first language that they're making, they're learning, like in my case, English, I would never judge that person harshly. I would just be like, oh, well, they're learning. I understand what they mean. No big deal. And go on with my life. So I always try to encourage my students who have like a bit of a perfectionist tendency to give ourselves as learners the same compassion that we extend to other people when they're practicing and when they're learning as well.
I've always had circumstances in Quebec where people will say, "Oh, I love your accent. I think it's amazing that you tried." Well, I'm providing the same thing to other people. We need to be more forgiving to ourselves for the mistakes that we make and recognize, again, that making mistakes is a learning opportunity. And we're not going to try to make that same mistake again. We're going to improve from learning from it.
And we should congratulate ourselves a little bit, don't you think? I mean, not everybody goes to the trouble of learning another language for whatever reasons. So, we're taking a risk. We're putting ourselves out there, we're challenging ourselves, and we're growing as human beings. That's kind of a beautiful thing.
I think so as well. Congratulate ourselves for trying, but also congratulate us on the opportunities it's going to provide us later on. I'm going to
Hmm.
be able to travel to BC and use my English language. I'm going to be able to travel, to Mexico and use my Spanish language. Your world opens up when you have this. So be
Hmm.
thankful that you're taking this chance,
Hmm.
and that it's going to pay off later.
So, Christopher, is there anything you'd like to recommend our listeners check out this week?
Absolutely. There's a comedy on Netflix called Life in Pieces that I absolutely adore. The cool thing about this show, first of all, it's a comedy, so it's mimicking everyday circumstances that people
Hmm.
typically go through. But each episode is about 24 minutes and it's split into four parts of maybe 5.5, 6 minutes each. So it definitely makes it more palatable for comprehension in short bursts. And it's really fun and it makes you laugh.
That sounds like a great show and a really unique format. I don't think I've seen one that's like that, that's got the four little sections. So that's something I'm curious about checking out as well.
I think a lot of students find comedies a little bit daunting of a task because they're so long, there's a lot of jokes, and they feel like everything gets lost in translation. But if it's in a short burst, they think that it's a little bit easier. If you don't understand something, you can rewind and try again.
I think that that's an excellent point to make, and it makes it fun when you do get the joke. You have that little moment of satisfaction of understanding something tricky in a second language. It's always a great feeling. For my part this week, I'm going to recommend something I'm calling French Fridays. And no, not French fries, it's not the edible one. And that's where I would suggest that if you and your family are learning a language together, it doesn't have to be French. I use French because, that's my context and our context in Quebec.
Right.
But could be English Fridays, could be Spanish Fridays. I would suggest that you devote a time each week with your family to practice together. You could watch a TV show in the language that you're learning, with or without subtitles, depending on everyone's level and comfort level. You could play a board game in French, have dinner in whatever language you're learning, and just to have some time together, but that time is devoted to doing whatever family activities you enjoy in the language that you're learning. It can kind of be a nice way, again, to get some practice in with people you feel comfortable with, and hopefully reduce that stress that we sometimes feel.
What are your favorite ways to practice?
I have to tell you that I have been watching Le Meilleur Pâtissier in French. And it's been quite a lot of fun because it's French, but France. So some of the expressions that I've been learning have been very, very enjoyable to sort of learn. And I'm looking forward to checking out a couple of the cooking shows that are debuting on Radio-Canada this fall. I saw that there's something, I think it's Cinq Chefs dans ma cuisine. So that's going to be one of my French Friday practice activities for sure this fall.
I have a big passion for cooking, so I'll probably have to check that out as well. And I find that watching cooking shows in French or even just reading recipes in French, it's really good practice because you can see the direct translations and you learn different vocabulary and verb tenses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you pursue something that you're interested in, it's automatically more motivating. Chris, thank you again so much for joining me on Les Bons Mots. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here.
I had a blast. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Pleasure was all mine. That brings us to the end of this week's episode of Les Bons Mots. Check out our website at lesbonsmots.ca. We have a lot of great content on our blog where we post regularly about news, culture, and language learning. You can also see our language learning videos there. This week, Lauren has posted about strategies you can use to improve your listening skills. Do you have any questions? We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at lesbonsmots@lesateliers.ca or find us on Facebook and Instagram at lesateliers.ca. Reach out to us if you're interested in learning more about our language training programs, or if you want to talk to us about ways you can improve your skills. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts to help other language learners find us. Thanks again, and happy practicing.